So we've got two scriptures this morning. I'll start with the Mark passage. It's Mark 12:13-17, and then one out of Revelation. These are both very familiar passages, so hear now the word of God. Later they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew the hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought him the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is on this, and whose inscriptions?" "Caesar," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. And then from Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 through 18. "Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast." Sorry, I got lost. "And it performed great signs, and even causing fire to come down from heaven in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the first beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given all the power to breathe to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. Let the people who have insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of man. That number is 666. So as I said, we've got two really famous passages. The key verses that I'm going to use out of both of these passages, you could probably just state. Right? So if I say to you, "Render unto Caesar," can you finish that? And yeah, and also the mark of the beast. We all kind of know, maybe not as well as the Caesar verse, but we do know it and know kind of how it's been interpreted. We'll talk about that a little later. So the way I'm going to approach this, I'm going to talk about both of these passages separately, and then we'll go back and kind of combine them and hopefully see what God's trying to tell us between these two, because I think they're very related. So the passage in Mark, the passage about paying taxes, is in all the synoptic gospels. So the synoptic gospels are the first three gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke. Those are the three that they're called synoptic, meaning they see as one. Basically, they're all sort of the same. They have mostly the same stories in them, kind of tell the tale the same way. So this one's in all three of them. It's in a series of interactions between Jesus and the leaders of the Jewish faith. And anytime Jesus interacts with the Jewish faith, the Jewish leaders, it tends to not be good. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it tends to be somewhat contentious. And those are all that way. They're all very interesting stories. As Mark points out here, and Jesus catches on to, the question is a trap. It's basically a heads I win, tails you lose kind of a thing. Because taxes, as you might imagine, were not popular with the Jewish people. The more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, none of us like taxes. And so, if he were to say, yeah, you got to pay your taxes, then it would cost him in popularity. But if he were to say, nah, you shouldn't be paying your taxes, well, we kind of know what happens to people who don't pay taxes, right? Y'all know who Wesley Snipes is? Wesley Snipes, he's a movie actor, been in a lot of movies. His most famous one is probably the Trinity series, which is not religious at all. It's actually about vampires. I've never seen it. There's more than one. But anyway, he made a lot of money on those. One small problem, he didn't pay any tax on it. And so much so that he went to jail, to prison, because he didn't pay taxes on that. So Jesus' answer here is very interesting. It's kind of it's an interesting answer because there's a jab on both ends of it, I think. Because he says, I remember in the King James, probably most of you do too, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, or render to God that which is God. In the the text I read today, it was out of the English Standard Version, give back to Caesar. And so Jesus begins the process of defining at least what the role is, in a sense. So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. So what does Caesar deserve to get? Well, whether we like taxes or not, we have to have some sort of revenue. This is one of the things the tax protester movements always want to. We want to abolish the Internal Revenue Service. It's not like you're not going to have some sort of bureaucracy that's going to collect taxes. I mean, that's just nuts. So I never have understood that. But part of the problem, and we'll get into this a little later, is what's going on in the Roman world. One of the things that renders unto Caesar is something that may belong to God. And that's part of what Jesus, I think, is saying here. That he's saying render to Caesar what's Caesar, but then render to God what's God. And he's not necessarily talking about tithe, he's talking about allegiances too, I think. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then we move from that into the Revelation passage. Now, I have to be very honest about Revelation. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. It has a very interesting history. Martin Luther, I don't know if you know this or not, but Martin Luther put together his own Bible and left Revelation out. He also left the book of James out. He called the Epistle of James the Epistle of Straw, because it doesn't talk about Jesus any. I find that very interesting because the Epistle of James is one of the most influential epistles for John Wesley, who started the Methodist movement. So what Luther didn't like, Wesley embraced. It's just kind of interesting. But back to Revelation. Now, I have to tell you, I've got to give you my background. I grew up in a Baptist church, and Jesus was coming at any minute. There's just no question. He was going to come, take us away. We weren't going to have to suffer. My view, and it was a scary book, my view has changed substantially in the meantime. So I have to tell you that and I'm going to butcher this word, Istochrist, I have a historicistic view of Revelation. And what that means is that I believe that Revelation really was fulfilled in the first century, but it's been continued to be fulfilled throughout history. So in my mind, well, we'll talk about that in just a second. I also have an idealist view. There's 4 views of Revelation, those are 2 of them. So I have half of them. Lucky me. And what this idealistic view says that the prophecies here in Revelation portray the ongoing cosmic conflict of spiritual realities and may have many fulfillments throughout history. And I do believe it's kind of circular. That we see these conflicts that are recorded in Revelation happening over and over and over again. And it's what I find so fascinating about Revelation is it's the very broad brushstrokes view of history, if you will. That almost any age in which you want to pick, you can find something relevant to that in the book of Revelation. So I don't think that the mark on the forehead and the right hand that we read about earlier are literal. And we'll talk about that in a bit. I also am not, Christ will return, I'm not saying that, but I'm not really looking for a rapture, and I'm not really looking for us to be spared from some great tribulation. Because I don't really know that that's what Revelation says. Okay? Also don't ascribe to the idea that they're an antichrist. There's been lots of antichrists over the years. There's lots of antichrists now. This morning I was watching a video. It's from the Two Preachers, and I'm not advertising their YouTube channel, but because I thought what they were going to say is, the title of the video is "The Earth's Being Shaken" with all these natural disasters, and obviously a sign of the end times, right? And I look at those and I just think, that's the world in which we live. Natural disasters happen. It's just how the world works. But then they showed some people in Pakistan, families in Pakistan who were in slavery, in debt slavery, who were working in a brick factory. They were making bricks, and they had their 7, 8-year-old kids out there making bricks. That's pretty sad. And I happen to think, when you go back and you look at the history, pre-industrial revolution, you look at that history, and then when the industrial revolution comes into England, they have a lot of children working in these factories. You may not know this, but Sunday school was started by Methodists because on Sunday, when the mills were closed, the kids would just be out on the street. And so Methodists organized Sunday school, and that really was the beginning of public schools, frankly. They taught them to read and write, and made a huge difference in those kids' lives. They began the process of trying to reform that situation so the kids wouldn't be working in factories. Okay, so earlier in this chapter that I read out of Revelation, there's another beast, the beast that comes out of the sea. And I don't want to spend time talking about, it's got 10 horns and 10 crowns on the 10 horns and what all that means. But Jews have always viewed the sea as Gentiles in a sense. Nothing good happens at the sea. They're one of the biggest, when they were the biggest nation in the world, when David and Saul were ruling, they didn't have a navy, even though they have coastline. They don't like the sea. That's what makes the story of Jonah so interesting for Jews, because he gets on a boat. Jews don't get on boats. But he gets on a boat because he thinks God's not going to be in the sea. The second beast, the one we're dealing with, comes from the earth. Now what I find interesting about that is, where did Adam come from? The earth. So maybe an interpretation is here, this is a Jewish person? I don't know. He obviously comes out from people. And he forces people to worship the first beast. Oh, let me back up. The second beast represents the incarnation of the worldview of the first beast. A life without God, or possibly with empire as God. And we'll talk about empire in a bit. So, he forces people to worship the first beast, and then he says no one can buy and sell unless you have the mark of the beast on the forehead or on the right hand. So, we popularly take these things literally, right? You'll often hear stories about, oh, they're going to implant such and such in your right hand or whatever. But in Jewish apocalyptic literature, which is what Revelation really is, it's Jewish apocalyptic literature, that would have meant a couple of things. The forehead is the seat of perception. So the forehead is basically kind of what you believe or how you view the world. So if you have the mark of the beast on the forehead, that means that you view the world like the beast does, or congruent, if you will, with the beast. And the right hand denotes action. So when you have the mark of the beast on your right hand, you act in accordance with the beast. That's really what this is trying to say, I think. So both of these passages really deal with what I'm going to call empire and the kingdom of God. So now I've used this fancy word empire. What does that mean? Well, dictionary.com says empire is a group of nations or people ruled over by an emperor, empress, or other powerful sovereign or government, usually a territory of greater extent than a kingdom, as the former British Empire, the French Empire, Russian Empire, Byzantine Empire, or Roman Empire. But here's a Christian definition of empire. I want you to listen to this, please. Empire describes the massive concentration of power that permeates all aspects of life and that cannot be controlled by any one actor alone. Empire seeks to extend its control as far as possible, not only geographically, politically, and economically, but also intellectually, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, culturally, and religiously. And that's from Dr. Reiger, who's a professor at SMU, Southern Methodist University. Now, I haven't read the book. He's got a book out that comes from called Christ and Empire. Based on some reviews I read about the book, I probably wouldn't agree with most of it, but I like his definition. So when you think about that, empire, we end up thinking about a lot of things. When I originally conceived the idea of the sermon, I was going to talk about empire as government, and I certainly think that applies. Governments get bigger over time. They get more and more stuff in their grasp. You know, there's a Chinese curse, supposedly. It's debatable whether it comes from China or not, but a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. We definitely live in interesting times. We have seen government exert a lot of authority in these interesting times. So in the Roman Empire, I alluded to this a little earlier, in the Roman Empire, they began to do Caesar worship. In other words, they would say sometimes, for a lot of times, it was a dead Caesar, that they were a god, now a god. And then later on, it would be the current one. And part of what you have to do is declare your allegiance to Caesar, that Caesar is Lord. And when Christians says Jesus is Lord, what are they saying about Caesar? And that's part of the double entendre, if you will, of Jesus has rendered to Caesar that which is Caesar. He's not God. He's not Lord. Yes, he is in that charge of the government, and yes, you do owe him taxes, but he is not Lord. That is God's realm. The problem with that is when you have that structure, anyone whose values and structures and dynamics contradict those of the prevailing culture have to be silenced. So, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, they had the gulags, which is where they sent who? Christians and people who didn't agree with communist way. Or they eventually killed them. The Revelation passage is written to people under persecution. I find it very interesting with people who have a futurist view of Revelation. That's one of the other views. When you have the futurist view of Revelation, the idea is that the whole book, basically past chapter 3, takes place in the future. And why would somebody who's having to deal with persecution, with their very life being threatened, want to read about what's going to happen thousands of years later? It had to have some relevance to them. The number of his name, the 666, if you take Caesar Nero's name in Hebrew and turn it into a number, it's 666. So there are a lot of scholars believe it was written prior to his reign or during his reign, one of the two, because of that. One of the messages in Revelation is that to the saints is that their persecution and martyrdom hastens the end of the person persecuting them, or the entity persecuting them. That's kind of interesting to think about it in those terms. So where does this leave us? You know, most everybody in here is at my age or older, probably. A few of you aren't, but most of you are. And so I grew up in late 60s, early 70s in Abilene, Texas, which is the buckle of the Bible Belt. I mean, we were so religious, we had three religious colleges in our town. There was a church literally on every corner. So, in my growing up years, I saw no deviation from being a good American and being a good Christian. To me, those kind of were the same thing. They were congruent, to use a math term. So I didn't see a lot of conflict with empire. But I don't live in that world anymore. And frankly, I'm not sure it was as good as I thought. I think I compromised a lot of faith, a lot of my faith to be there. Now you can disagree with me and that's fine. I'm not here to try to convince you of that. But now I think we live in different times. We live in interesting times. Now I think it's interesting, I'm going to be a bit political. I think it's interesting that in these times in which